Buick is a brand truly stuck in the middle. General Motors calls them a premium brand, and that's because they have Cadillac as their luxury brand. And we really don't see this cadence with other manufacturers. The closest you could get maybe is something like Mini, because BMW is the luxury brand, Mini is the premium brand, but this is not like a Mini Countryman. It is significantly less expensive. For 2025, the Encore GX starts at $27,295. So the important thing to remember about Buick is that not all of their products are easy to classify. The Enclave, the biggest SUV in the lineup, is a solid competitor to the Lexus TX or the Acura MDX. The Encore, on the other hand, its competition is far more mainstream than luxury. To frame this discussion properly, we need to talk a bit about the competition, what it is and what it logically is not. The important thing to remember about Buick and Chevy is that between the two of them, they are attacking this same segment with a total of 4 vehicles. We have the Trailblazer, the Trax, the Encore GX, and the Envista. The Trax and the Envista are closely related. The Trailblazer and the Encore are closely related. If you want all-wheel drive, you need to Trailblaze or you need to Encore. If you are only interested in front-wheel drive with some practicality and a little bit more style, that's where the Trax and the Envista come in. Between that quartet of vehicles, General Motors pushed 194,000 small SUVs in this segment. That's nearly 3 times the sales of a Honda HR-V, and it's certainly over 3 times the sales of the HR-V if you add in the Cadillac XT4. And that's part of why the mission of the Encore GX is different, because GM has so many other options out there that they've cornered every little nook and cranny of the mainstream, premium, and the luxury segment as well. Intriguingly, the XT4 is actually the second best-selling luxury small SUV in the United States, just behind the Volvo XC40. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the Encore. This is supposed to be a bit more style-forward, a little bit more premium, I guess you'd say, than the Chevy, whether we're talking about the Trailblazer or the Trax, but the price tag of this is right on top of the Trailblazer. So really, it's just going to come down to what style you prefer and whether you like your local Chevy or your local Buick dealer better. Style-wise, I think this definitely looks fancier, I guess you'd say, than the Trailblazer and the Trax, but I do think that the Chevy front-end design is a bit more my taste than this relatively hungry front-end. Let me know what you think about this down there. We do have premium touches that you'd expect in a more expensive vehicle, though, like the LED light pipe here that also functions as the turn signal. They have a divorced headlight arrangement, so the LED headlights are there. And this is the Avenir trim, which was new for 2024, so it has some extra chrome and some extra bling here and there. In addition to the hungry grille, all models get the new Buick logo, which does give me a bit of a buck-tooth vibe up front. And then this model has the optional 360-degree camera, which is really well integrated into the grille. Really hides nicely. With an overall length just over 171 inches, the Encore is on the short side of this segment. It's a whopping 8 inches shorter than the Honda HR-V. But interestingly, it has a cargo area that's about the same size with or without the second row folded. And the second row has pretty similar legroom actually to the Honda HR-V when we're talking about real-world room. The reason for that is the short hood profile. This has a relatively short hood, especially compared against something like the Mazda CX-30, which has that really elongated sort of luxurious front end look to it that's a lot less space practical than the design that we find here. Bearing in mind that today we're taking a look at the top end version of the Encore, one thing that's more luxury than mainstream is the tire choice. This is a 245/45 R19 tire in the Avenir trim. Most trims are going to get 225 width tires, and both of those tire sizes are bigger than average for this segment. This is significantly wider than the widest tire you can get from the factory in a Mazda CX-30, for instance. And the Buick Encore is lighter than average for this segment. As we work our way around to the back, you may have noticed that this model has a lot less black cladding than most of the competition. That's because we're driving the top-end trim. If you like the black cladding, just get the other 2 versions of the Encore, and then you'll get the black sills and the black wheel arches, etc. We have full LED taillights back here, but we also have one of my least favorite touches in a lot of new cars, and that is totally fake exhaust tips integrated into the bumper. These black plastic sections here are definitely going to scratch easily, and because these cut into the bumper really quite deeply, they're also going to be tricky to clean. It would probably be easier to clean a real exhaust cutout. On the active safety front, Buick is marching to a slightly different drummer. Autonomous emergency braking, lane keeping assistance, blind spot monitoring, and cross-traffic detection are standard, but we don't get adaptive cruise control like we do find in a number of the competitors. That's part of a package that also includes the 360-degree camera system and rear parking sensors that this model has on it, and strangely also a wireless phone charger. The engine lineup is certainly more mainstream than luxury, and in some circles it has been a bit controversial. If you're in one of those circles, I would remind you, however, that when we combine the quadruplet of options that GM is making, this is by far the most popular drivetrain in this segment. Now, there are two choices. If you get the base version of the Encore only, you get a 1.2-liter 3-cylinder turbo that produces 137 horsepower, 162 pound-feet of torque, sends power only to the front wheels via a continuously variable transmission. If you choose the 1.3-liter turbo, which you're going to find in every other version of Encore, you get 155 horsepower, 174 pound-feet of torque, and you can choose whether you want the CVT and better fuel economy, or whether you want a 9-speed automatic transmission and all-wheel drive. The all-wheel drive option is going to drop your fuel economy down by 3 miles per gallon city, 3 on the highway as well, so definitely something to keep in mind there. But on the other hand, it also brings with it a fully independent rear suspension. If you get the front-wheel drive versions of the Encore, you get a Watts-Link suspension in the rear, not far off what we find in a Mazda CX-30. If you get the all-wheel drive version, then you get a fully independent rear suspension. And of course, if you want more power and a fully independent rear suspension, then you can get the Cadillac XT4 because it has a 4-cylinder turbo. Front seat comfort lands somewhere between worlds. On the driver's side of this Avenir trim, we have two-way adjustable lumbar support. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a reasonable range of motion and 2-position memory, things that we don't always find on the competition. And the front passenger seat, that's a weirder twist because it has the two-way lumbar support. It has a seat bottom cushion that tilts, which is nice, but the back, the seat back, that's manual. I have to admit, if I was going to give up one particular power adjustment move, it would be the seat back actually, because the seat recline mechanism, that doesn't bother me to be manual, but I do like the fact that the passenger seat bottom cushion tilts. Jumping into the back seat, it's pretty obvious that combined legroom is towards the lower end of this segment. This is simply the kind of vehicle you would have lots of troubles fitting a larger rear-facing child seat behind anybody that's of average height up front. I have maybe about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of legroom left with the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. With this front seat, most of its way back, not actually quite all the way back, my knees are definitely digging into the seat back itself. Now, speaking of the seat backs, rather oddly, this one has a hard insert right here on the seat back, whereas we just have the upholstered seat back on the driver's side. We have storage pockets with both, but there is a reason for that. This front seat folds down. So if you did want to put really long items inside the vehicle, you could fold this 60% side of the second row right there, and then you could actually get really long items inside. I don't know if you wanted to camp or something like that, you could do that. Or if for some reason you wanted to grab a 7-foot or an 8-foot ladder from Home Depot, you could actually put one in here. Other nice touches include a fold-down center armrest that's a little bit wider than average with 2 big cup holders and a shoulder belt that does not come out of the ceiling, it comes out of the seat back. So if you want to put child seats back here, especially like booster seats, things like that, they're going to be better centered in the rear seat back and less likely to interfere with the outboard buckles. Behind the power hatch, we find 23.5 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That was enough to squeeze 4 24-inch roller bags back here. And if you fold the second row down, then you'll get 50.2 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's pretty similar to the HR-V and the Kona. The Kona has about 2 cubic feet more than this. The HR-V has 1 cubic foot more than this and 5 cubic feet more if the rear seats are folded. However, this has more cargo room than the Mazda CX-30. And a lot of that simply has to do with that CX-30's long hood, which does reduce the interior practicality a bit. But there's some other things at play here. First though, let's talk about the cargo cover, because this has one of those hard variety of cargo covers. That's not exactly my preference because they just don't fold up as conveniently. We have a reasonable amount of space back here yet again. You can line up these 22-inch roller bags pretty much right across the back and fit 4 of them as well, with a decent amount of additional luggage if you scoot them all the way to the back, and you could then put about 2 up front. So nice, easy, deep cargo well there. It also has a 2-stage design, so I can lift up the floor to a higher height, and then let's see if we can store the cargo cover under there. Looks like, yes, you can. So that is a handy touch. Not as handy as the roller shades, but it does give you somewhere, there we go, to put that cover if you need to. Going for a deep dive under the floor, there's that hard cargo cover again. I'll just go ahead and remove the floor from the equation so you can see what's going on under here. Let's take this out as well, because we have a temporary spare tire, something we don't find in all of the competition. And that does give us greater practicality. It also explains why this cargo area is a little bit smaller than some. Buick makes the most of the space by putting the subwoofer inside the spare tire, but they also wasted some space by this big foam divider just under it. All right, let's take a look around the interior. Up here we have the garage door opener buttons, some kind of old school reading lights where that entire plastic module moves as you press it, OnStar buttons, and then the rear view camera display. This is not the same camera readout as the backup camera. Two different cameras, two different displays. Over here we have slide to the side sun visors with vanity lights and mirrors inside, and you'll find that on the driver and the passenger side. Grab handles for 3 of the 4 seating positions. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and the front passenger. And speaking of the front passenger, that's what that seat looks like when it's completely folded. It's a bit difficult to show you the angles in here, but that's why we have that hard plastic section again on the top and on the bottom of the passenger seat, but we still have that storage pocket between. In case you're wondering, that's what the key looks like. The Buick button is the lock button. We then have unlock, power hatch, remote start, and then the panic button there. Moving over to the front doors, we find actually more soft touch plastics than I would normally expect in something with this price tag. We have a soft touch upper injection molded section. We then have a stitched midsection in imitation leather right there around that armrest. And then of course hard plastics down there along the bottom of the door around that bottle holder, etc. Moving on to the dashboard, also more soft touch materials than I had honestly expected. We have a soft touch midsection with some faux after stitching right there, and then a soft touch lower section of the dashboard that definitely improves the feel. Although you should know, this is not as squishy as most, upper dashboards. It's more kind of rubbery, I guess I'd describe it that way. We have a decently sized bin-style glove compartment. I was able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Moving to the top of the dashboard, that's a soft touch injection molded piece as well, with a sort of a metal effect trim running across there. It's designed to look like knurled metal, but it is of course plastic. Moving to the middle of the dashboard, we find one of the reasons to get this over some of the competition, and that is that we have a pretty big standard infotainment LCD. We also find a pretty big instrument cluster standard. This is an 8-inch LCD, this is an 11-inch LCD, although the big plastic binnacle around them, that kind of makes the displays look a little bit smaller than they are. Also, there's the design of the software. If I go in close, you'll notice there's actually a black border in the software on the top that CarPlay does not get to use, and then over here on this side. So we have things like the home button there, and it takes us to a very darkly themed software interface. Same goes for the instrument cluster, I'll show you in a bit. And I think that just sort of conspires to make the screen look a little bit smaller than it actually is. I would have liked to have seen, for instance, if Apple CarPlay could expand its background over to the entire screen as we see in some other GM models, because that would have made the display look a bit bigger. The display itself, the panel I should say, also has this sort of horn-rimmed glasses motif, or maybe Hanna-Barbera sign, something like that. I'm not the biggest fan of that particular design. That's one of my little qualms about Buick's design language. I think I like the screen arrangement in the Chevy and the Cadillac a little bit better, but this is definitely very, very style forward, probably exactly what you'd want in something in this segment. Down below we have dual zone automatic climate control. A lot of entries here have only single zone. We then have controls for the heated seats in 3 stages right there. Engine start stop button over there. Nice big air vents, easy to find, and the airflow is quite nice. Down here we have a 12-volt power port, 2 USB inputs. The system supports wireless CarPlay in addition to wired smartphone projection, but I prefer the wired. There's also a charging mat down there. That's part of that package I mentioned earlier. Over here we should explain a few of these buttons. Auto start step disable, that's a nice touch. The lane keep assist button there. The stability control button, and then we have this all-wheel drive button here. Like many of GM's products, if you don't have all-wheel drive engaged, the system will never send power to the rear. So if you're in drive and you're on snow and you floor it, the front tires are just going to spin and spin and spin until you actually engage all-wheel drive. That's to reduce the impact on fuel economy of the all-wheel drive system in the vehicle, to try and give you better real-world fuel economy in most driving situations. Over here we have 2 pretty big cup holders, pretty traditional shifter right there. low mode there. If you put it in low mode, then you can use the shifter buttons on the side of that console shifter. Otherwise, they are disabled. Behind all that, we have, I guess, sort of a juice box or water box holder there. It's pretty deep, so you can definitely store some of those larger items in there. And if you are planning on jangling keys around here, this plastic is hard. It's not going to scratch as easily as the black or chromed trim that we find elsewhere in the vehicle. I noticed that this black surround already shows lots of fine scratches on it. This car only has 2,000 miles on it. Over here we have hard plastic. On this side, the passenger side, there's actually a soft touch insert at the top there. Moving on back here, we have a storage compartment just under the relatively skinny center armrest with a divider that reveals a really quite deep storage area. You could definitely put half gallons of milk in there if you really squeezed them in. It's just barely wide enough for that. And then we have the padded armrest on top. Moving over to the driver's side, I have to apologize for the glare here. This is a really shiny display cover, and again, it kind of belies the size of the LCD. It spans from around there to just down there by that little heat icon. It's an 8-inch LCD, and it is a full LCD cluster. It offers a few different gauge layouts, so I can choose that vehicle info design, I can choose a gauge layout that's a little on the simplistic side for me, and then I can choose one more layout right there that's not too far off. It really just doesn't have a tachometer. Instead, it has this sort of speed gauge sort of thing going on there. Very faintly you can see 20, 40 miles an hour, etc. It's not exactly my favorite because I don't think it uses the real estate of that screen as well as other GM full LCD clusters. Moving out from there, we find, of course, the Buick steering wheel with that updated Buick logo there. The controls for the cruise control system, adaptive cruise control in this model over there on that side, along with the steering wheel heat button, and then these buttons control the multifunction LCD. The volume up, down, and track forward, backward buttons, those are on the back of the steering wheel. It's a round design with sport grips up top, and I think it's a relatively attractive and solid steering wheel design just all around. On this side, more of that imitation metal trim, and then an actual headlight control down here. So this is not one of those new GM models where they've completely deleted the headlamp control and put it in software. We still have a few physical buttons, including the power and volume knob for the infotainment system itself. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 8.8 seconds. You'll notice it takes a bit to get the car moving, and that's why at speed it feels a bit peppier than that 8.8 second number would otherwise indicate. The 0 to 10 mile speed, it does take a while in the Encore GX, whether we are talking about the 9-speed automatic or the CVT in the front wheel drive trims. Now, I was able to 0 to 60 test a model provided by my local Buick dealer. That one ran 0 to 60 in 9.2 seconds, so a little bit slower actually than the one with the 9-speed auto. And I think that has to do with the gear ratios involved because there's no wheel slip in either of these on most paved road surfaces. That's relatively average for this segment. It's not going to set your hair on fire. If you want to go quicker, 0 to 60, there is something like that CX-30 turbo that is particularly quick. It has a lot more power than the 1.3 liter turbo we find in this model. Now, the other thing you'll notice, especially if you pay attention closely and turn your sound up while we accelerate here, is the sound of this engine. It does not sound like a 4-cylinder engine. A lot of folks are surprised by this, but it has to do with the way that engine exhaust and intake harmonics work with one another. So a 3-cylinder engine sounds an awful lot more like a 6-cylinder engine. Doesn't sound exactly the same, but sounds more like a 6-cylinder engine than a 4-cylinder engine, or more like a 6-cylinder engine than a 4-cylinder engine sounds like a V8. 4-cylinders and V8s, they don't sound alike. This and 6-cylinder engines do. Let's get back to this Avenir trim though, because what was also surprising about this model is its handling ability and its stopping distance. From 60 miles an hour back to 0, these brakes have really good grip, surprisingly good grip actually, and they were able to stop this from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in just 112 feet. And this does not have performance tires on it. These are just regular old all seasons. And that's possible because we have a relatively light curb weight. This model weighs just 3,273 pounds. This is one of the lightest entries in this segment. It is notably lighter than a Mazda CX-30, riding on considerably wider tires. And that's why this doesn't just stop quickly, it handles impressively well also. you can drive this significantly harder out on this road than you can drive a CX-30 or a Honda HR-V or a Corolla Cross or even some of those newer options like a Kona or a Seltos, etc. This has a shocking amount of grip and decent composure on the rougher roads in this area in the corners. And that's thanks to the multi-link independent suspension in the rear. You are definitely going to notice a difference in terms of handling capability between the models with independent suspensions and without. And in this segment, that's important to know because there are a decent number of models where independent rear suspensions are either not available or they're only available in the models with all-wheel drive. When it comes to the handling score, this Avenir trim certainly gets an A+. The grip is solid, but more impressively, there's the price tag, which we're gonna get to in a moment. Compared to the competition, every version of the Encore is going to handle really quite well. Part of that's down to the tires, part of that's down to the suspension design, and a decent percentage is down to the curb weight, which is among the lightest available. Now, there are some downsides. Obviously, the suspension and the tires are writing checks that the engine just can't cash, but you do get that throaty 3-cylinder sound while you're trying to speed up on roads like this, so sometimes it sounds a little bit faster than it actually is. Out on the gravel road that we're on here, I will say that the ride quality is a little bit lower in this Avenir trim than the base models and a little bit lower than some of the competition, mainly because we have those lower profile tires. I honestly am surprised that Buick decided to put tires that are this low profile and this wide on the Avenir trim. I would have thought that maybe something with a little bit more sidewall would have been a bit more appropriate, but again, I do love the handling capability that they impart to the Encore. You should know though that if you go a little bit further off the beaten path on roads like this, then keep that in mind. Also, keep in mind the all-wheel drive option I mentioned earlier. So right now we're on this loose gravel surface here. I'm going to make sure the engine doesn't stop. Turned off the all-wheel drive. If I floor it, just lots and lots of front wheel slip. And you will notice it even more up slopes like this. So if I didn't have all-wheel drive on and I just floor it here, you don't really go much anywhere. You're just depending on the traction control until you hit that all-wheel drive button. Now, feels totally normal. Just a little tiny bit of front wheel scrabble, much better acceleration because you get more power going to the rear. That is one big difference between this and really all the competition. Even in something like a Toyota Corolla Cross Hybrid, which has more of a slip and grip style with a little bit of e-help on the back, you're still going to get more sure-footed traction without pressing buttons. So here you do have to remember to press that button, and that is the big difference there. I don't think it's a big deal, and it is going to save you fuel on regular driving. So if you want the 9-speed automatic transmission, you don't know if you need the extra traction, you just like the feel, get this, leave the all-wheel drive off, you will get slightly better fuel economy in daily driving. Back out on the paved road, we measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quieter options when it comes to cabin noise. You will definitely hear more road noise in some of the competitors that have narrower tires. So when it comes to the cabin noise score, I'm a bit more impressed here than some of the other options that are around here in terms of their sound levels, because we have wider tires here and road noise is really kept well in check. Fuel economy has also been pretty decent. We've been averaging 26.8 miles per gallon, even though we've been driving this harder than most of the competition. You will get slightly better fuel economy in some of the models with CVTs. You'll obviously get better fuel economy in the Corolla Cross Hybrid, but you won't really be getting better fuel economy on average in something like the Mazda CX-30. CX-30 Turbo is a lot of fun in a straight line. Not as much fun in the bendies as this, but you're also going to have to pay a toll when it comes to fuel economy. And for the Mazda, a lot of that has to do with the older 6-speed automatic transmission under the hood. Buckle your seatbelts, it's time to dive into pricing and comparisons now. When you look at this closely, it's pretty obvious General Motors is really trying to thread the needle between the mainstream and the premium ends of the subcompact crossover segments. The Encore GX starts at $27,295 for 2025. That includes destination, and will go on up to $39,180 before dealer-installed accessories, tax, title, license, etc. That is right in line with a number of the mainstream competition, but a little bit more than the Chevy Trailblazer, which starts at $24,395. We don't know exactly where the new Acura ADX is going to slot in, but the rumor mill says it should start below $40,000. Expect it to be somewhere around the pricing of the Lexus UX, perhaps a little bit more, but probably not as low as the Encore GX. And that's logical because the Encore really is this unusual sort of mainstream upgrade rather than more of a dedicated luxury vehicle like the Cadillac XT4, for instance. Now, let's move on to the competition now, because this is probably the best way to frame the Encore GX. Versus a luxury entry, we'll just use the Audi Q3 here as the placeholder really for all of the luxury competition from especially Europe. So Q3, XC40, think BMW X1, X2, Mercedes-Benz, etc., etc., etc. Basically, these luxury entries do essentially everything better than the Buick. They're faster, they handle better, they look nicer on the outside, they're more premium on the inside, they have better materials, etc. They're more fun, more novel, definitely flashier. But they're also all going to be significantly more expensive. The Audi Q3 is one of the least expensive entries in this particular segment, and it starts at $41,095. So it actually starts beyond the price range of the Buick. And that's quite logical because, again, the actual competitor to the Audi Q3 is something like the Cadillac XT4. That is in the price and power and performance category where you'd expect it to be a natural Audi competitor. So yes, the Audi does a lot better, but it's also going to cost you more. So this is that strong value proposition, or maybe not even value, just simply price tag. Let's move on to a trickier competitor, and that would be the Chevy Trailblazer. Now, the Trailblazer and the Encore are very closely related, but they're not as closely related as you might think on first glance, because the Trailblazer and the Encore GX don't share the same wheelbase or the same overall length. The Trailblazer is actually a bit longer, and the 2-inch wheelbase stretch results in about 3 inches more legroom. It also has a taller box on top, giving you more headroom on the inside and more cargo room behind the rear seats. You get about 2 cubic feet more back there. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when we're talking about a fairly small cargo area, it is a noticeable improvement. The engines and the transmissions, those are basically the same. The screens and the software inside, those are basically the same as well. Seats and things like that, very, very similar in terms of their structure, but the styling is definitely different. If you're a fan of the Buick styling, then go that direction. If you're a fan of the Chevy styling, obviously go that direction. Personally, I think the Chevy looks a little bit better. I don't know if it will age as well, but I do think that at the moment it looks a little bit better to my eye. We get a lot of the same practicality features on the inside, like the fold flat front passenger seat, etc. That's a common feature to both. And the big thing is that the big screens are available across these lineups as well. So if you want the big touchscreen, the big infotainment center in the middle, and of course the driver instrument cluster as well being an LCD, that smaller one, you'll find that on the Trailblazer also. Now, how about something like a Lexus UX? The Lexus UX is, in my personal opinion at the moment, one of the least competitive luxury small SUVs in America. It really is more of a hatchback than an SUV, let's be perfectly honest, and that's part of the problem. Lexus has this hatchback internationally that they're trying to sell as a competitor to a Q3 and X1, XC40 in North America, and I don't know if it works quite right. It's available only as a hybrid, which I think is actually a good idea, and the fuel economy is fantastic. So you'll get 42 miles per gallon combined front-wheel drive, 39 miles per gallon when equipped with all-wheel drive. That's significantly better than the 27 mpg in the Encore. Also, you get the Lexus dealer experience, Lexus reliability, and they recently added on a big touchscreen infotainment system to the dashboard. That's one of the biggest improvements that the UX has seen for a while, and it certainly helps the interior feel more tech-forward than when the UX first launched. But the UX is getting a little bit old at this point in time. I would love to see a complete redesign of this model to raise the seating point up a bit, give it a bit more ground clearance, and really make it more of a solid competitor to the European options. The bigger problem for the UX, though, is its price tag. It starts at $37,515, which is within the price range of the Encore GX, but you aren't going to get appreciably more performance. You get a bit more power according to the numbers, but 0 to 60 performance is still definitely on the slow side of things. Bit quicker than the Encore, mind you, but still really, really slow. Easily the slowest 0 to 60 time in that segment. Also, stopping distances are a little on the long side, and handling isn't quite as good as the German options. Moving on, the most tricky competitor, and the best competitor in a way for this, is the Mazda CX-30. Because the Mazda CX-30 is trying to be more of a premium entry as well. It has a mainstream logo on the front,
but the price range is very, very similar to the Encore. And in my mind, and I would say in most customers' minds, they're very similar in terms of their brand equity. CX-30 starts at $26,415, goes up to $38,965, including destination for a fully loaded model. If you're not a fan of turbocharged engines or CVTs, you won't find either of those on the Mazda. The base model makes do with a regular 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine that produces more power than we find in the Encore, and a regular 6-speed automatic transmission. That transmission isn't the most modern transmission available, but it does shift really nicely, and the fuel economy is pretty decent in that model. More exciting, though, is the turbo model, because it is one of the most powerful entries in this segment, even if you include the luxury competitors, because you'll get 250 horsepower, 320 pound-feet of torque through that regular old 6-speed automatic transmission. At that point, the 6-speed is not really much of a problem, or I should say, in this segment, the 6-speed isn't much of a problem, because even though we do find 9-speed autos in the Trailblazer and the Encore if you get all-wheel drive, most of the competition has a CVT, and the 6-speed is definitely more engaging than either. The big deal, of course, for the CX-30 is that it looks absolutely fantastic. I think it's easily the prettiest entry in this segment, and as far as the design exterior-wise goes, it also really holds its own when compared to the luxury entries. The Volvo XC40 looks great, but I do think that the CX-30 even still looks good in comparison to the Volvo. Not better, but still holds its own really well when it comes to the luxury segment. There are just a few things to keep in mind with the CX-30, however. We get less cargo room, about 3 cubic feet less than we find in the Buick. The roofline is a little bit lower. That's what gives it that really sleek sort of sports wagon kind of vibe, and that gives us less headroom in the back as well. Also, the CX-30 does not have an independent suspension in the rear. That's one of the things that separates it from the more luxury-oriented entries that do have a fully independent suspension. If you love driving your CX-30 hard, and trust me, you can drive that turbo model pretty hard, you will probably start to notice that lack of independent rear suspension on broken pavement on winding roads. However, I think it is still a really well-rounded package, and the pricing is absolutely fantastic. So while I may have troubles forgiving the CX-50 for having that particular rear suspension design, I think in the CX-30, it's absolutely just fine, and it's a ton of fun to drive. Bottom line, the Encore GX is great, but the Trailblazer and the CX-30 are also fantastic. The Trailblazer is probably going to be the least expensive in this trio. It already is a little bit less expensive than the Buick, and we all know that Chevy tends to have a lot of cash on the hood. So when you're out there shopping at MSRP, I think the CX-30 looks like a fantastic deal. The reality, of course, is you're going to be paying well below MSRP for that Trailblazer. You're probably also going to get really inexpensive financing on it. Now, on the Mazda CX-30, again, I think it looks fantastic. I might gravitate towards the base turbo trims. I think the turbo engine is just an absolute hoot and a half. It's the biggest asset for the CX-30 in this segment. But the regular CX-30 also has a decent amount of power from that standard engine. 191 horsepower is standard in the CX-30, and that's notably more than you'll find even optionally available in most of the mainstream competition, and pretty close to the power levels we find in the luxury segment as well. So CX-30 is a hoot and a half. It looks good, and it's well priced as well. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And do you prefer the styling of the Buick? Do you prefer the styling of the Mazda? These, I think, are the two toughest competitors when it comes to styling in this segment. I appreciate the chrome and the more luxury looks of the Buick, but if I had to pick simply on style, I would probably go for that Mazda. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and I'll see all of you next week.